small village in the eastern prairies of South Dakota, Manchester was just like any other town on the plains in its heyday.
A local spot for farmers to trade and a handful of community amenities like a post office, grocery store, train station, even a pool hall. Manchester was once home and the place of work for Grace Ingalls-Wilder, Laura's sister. Laura, Grace, and their sister Mary grew up in the next town over, in DeSmet. The area could not be a more perfect example of Northern Prairie's sodbuster culture and that pioneer lifestyle that inspired the Little House on the Prairie books.
And before that?
I went to South Dakota. I worked for this guy named Wayne.
What do you think about all this?
I like all this.
Like many mid-20th century prairie towns, Manchester was hit hard by the 1-2-3 punch of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and post-World War II urbanization. Manchester would lose its railroad lines to shifting demands. After World War II, new families began to move away from farming and into larger cities. As agriculture became mechanized and commercialized, fewer farmers were needed to grow crops on ever larger pieces of land. Fewer farming families and the emergence of corporate farms stole away the very reasons towns like Manchester existed. A local community to get supplies, educate children, do some old-school social networking, or just find entertainment. Hundreds of homesteads in the areas around town had been reduced to just dozens. This story has played out across all of the United States from the 1930s and beyond, and is still happening. Rural communities are shrinking, while larger towns and cities have grown. Manchester lost much of its population to nearby Huron. By the year 2000, Manchester had shrunk to just 40 residents, while Huron, South Dakota grew to more than 12,000 and is still modestly growing today. June 24, 2003. A dwindling Manchester is now just a few dozen structures occupied by a handful of families and a post office. At 2:15 p.m., a tornado watch is issued for southeast South Dakota. This was expected, and storm chasers from all over the United States have descended on the area. Numerous tornado-producing storms would soon form.
The stage has been set, a dwindling town with little purpose left for its immediate area. A few dozen structures stood occupied by just a handful of families. On June 24, 2003, a day Eastern South Dakotans call Tornado Tuesday, a nearly mile-wide F4 tornado approached from the south.
At this time, the storm-chasing team known as TriState had just deployed what they called turtle probes ahead of the tornado. A set of cone-shaped pods able to survive and gather meteorological data, and even some of the earliest tornado footage we have from inside of a tornado. Tim Samaras, the TriState project's founder and engineer, is credited with recording the fastest and deepest weather-related pressure drop of 100 millibar in just 12 seconds. Put another way, this is comparable to the pressure drop experienced by a Thunderbird fighter pilot in a vertical climb. The equally fast return of pressure would be double the speed experienced by a skydiver in a free fall. In a matter of moments, all structures in the town of Manchester were gone. The Manchester tornado received an F4 rating. An F4 tornado produces devastating damage, typically causing significant damage to well-built structures and wiping older or poorly constructed buildings completely away.
With all of the residents displaced, the post office in ruin, and all the businesses destroyed, everyone left.
Manchester is a story of a changing economic landscape combined with a natural disaster. It's very possible Manchester could have become a traditional ghost town, simply abandoned by its residents over time. The F4 tornado of June 24, 2003, instead lifted Manchester to a legendary piece of tornado history. The most notorious tornado in the record books is the TriState Tornado of March 18, 1925. It's called the TriState Tornado because it is believed a single tornado, or more likely, a tornado family, touched down in Missouri. It crossed southern Illinois and left an unbroken damage path deep into Indiana. A tornado family is a series of tornadoes from the same storm, though these cyclic supercell storms might have different behaviors. For instance, a second tornado can touch down before the previous tornado has fully lifted. A recent example of this happened in Dodge City, Kansas in 2016.
Yeah, we got two tornadoes again. Two tornadoes on the ground.
The TriState Tornado's stats are absolutely staggering. $1.6 billion in damage, the single deadliest tornado in U.S. history at 695 fatalities. The tornado or tornado family were on the ground for 3.5 hours straight. a 219-mile-long damage path, 300-mile-per-hour estimated F5 winds, and one town that would never return. Parrish, Illinois leads all of these tornado ghost towns in fatalities. More than 20% of the population would lose their lives in this unimaginable storm. When you think of the city or town you live in, even the worst natural disasters you can imagine might take only a fraction of homes and businesses. Rivers rise and flood a few structures and damage buildings in the lower parts of town. A typical hurricane might flood out some coastal structures, tear off roofs and awnings, and knock out power to parts of town. Extreme hurricanes like Dorian and Michael might level a town, but coastal cities are desirable places to live. They often get rebuilt, no matter the destruction. But with the worst tornadoes up against small rural towns, it's different. The former town of Melva, Missouri is located in the Ozarks, in a forest south of Branson, Missouri. Not much is left to see of the former town today. Just shy of 100 years ago, what was likely at least a strong F4 tornado completely scraped the small, short-lived town of Melva, founded only a few decades earlier. 11 people lost their lives, and the town was never rebuilt. Today, other than a few foundations and some paver blocks, it is nearly absorbed into its surroundings. If you're a little superstitious, then you might find it a good idea to avoid the town of Codell, Kansas on May 20th. Codell, Kansas isn't a ghost town, but an example of why one tornado may not be the end of even the smallest rural towns. Or in this case, actually, 3 different tornadoes. 3 years in a row, on the same date. Incredibly, on May 20, 1916, May 20, 1917, and May 20, 1918, Codell, Kansas was hit by a tornado, each not destroying the entire town, but certainly causing damage and creating a wild statistical anomaly. More recently, the school moved out, the population has shrunk, and some buildings have been abandoned. Not all of the town is like this, of course, but just as with Manchester, and another example you'll hear about soon, Codell isn't alone among slowly declining rural plains towns. This is a story playing out over the entire Great Plains. So many towns are shrinking and have been losing their importance compared to their heydays. Speaking of superstitions, this black cat would take an interest in me a few times while filming. Coincidences like this really aren't statistically that crazy when you consider the area. Codell is in the heart of traditional Tornado Alley, and this coincidence happened on a calendar date that sits squarely in the middle of the statistical peak for tornadoes. Just to illustrate that point even further, 101 years and a few days later, and only hours after recording these videos, I would film a rain-wrapped monster grinding its way near Waldo, Kansas, just 20 miles from where I was standing in Codell. Though I didn't really get a great look at this tornado, and the damage it caused in the road network in the area meant that I wouldn't get any closer to many tornadoes the storm would continue to drop later. My chasing buddies would have much better luck. I blame the cat. Even though Codell, Kansas isn't technically a ghost town, it kind of feels like one. Have a look around. So long as there are economically depressed towns on the plains, the danger of more tornado ghost towns joining the ranks in the future is unfortunately inevitable. Tornado winds are compact, and they can lift objects, not just tip them over, and the winds change direction quickly. Imagine a 200+ mile-per-hour tempest comes through in just seconds. That is larger than the entire size of the typical small American town, and then leaves nothing behind. Most people will survive by getting underground and into shelters in time. However, little else remains. No trees, no homes, no businesses, totaled vehicles. There's no hospital, no drugstore, no dentist, no water, no school, no jobs. What would you do? 2011 was an infamous year for the Plains and Deep South. A half-dozen EF5 tornadoes and many hundreds of fatalities. One city would see a significant portion of it completely annihilated. The hospital was moved off of its foundation. A high school was destroyed. Hundreds of homes were leveled. And while this was a mile-wide and incredibly destructive tornado, the city of Joplin was far larger and economically important. Large cities are not immune to tornadoes, and it's extremely important that everyone understand this. It's not the end of the road for a city the size of Joplin, but the human and economic toll were sobering. I recommend this video from Jason Persoff. It's a first-hand account from a storm-chasing doctor turned on-the-spot emergency responder. His frank and candid speech may blow your mind. 8 years later, it's actually getting kind of difficult to find evidence a tornado even happened. Instead, this area of Joplin looks like any brand new suburb at the edge of a thriving city, but it's right in the middle of town. There's a new hospital, a new high school, and hundreds of brand new homes. Still, those scars are there if you look closely. Trees take time to grow, some lots remain empty, and even some scars have become whimsical memorials. Thanks for watching the first half of this two-part series. I'll be back shortly with the finale. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss it.